12 years. That's how long it took for a female superhero-led movie to be made between 2005 2017, and it wasn't even the more progressively minded MCU that made it happen. It was DC and Patty Jenkins who brought women to the front of the line where they belonged in superhero franchise history. Our review on this episode of the Superhero Pantheon is, of course, Wonder Woman.
I learned this the hard way a long, long time ago.
What is your mission?
To stop the war.
What war?
The war to end all wars. Weapons far deadlier than you can ever imagine.
The war can be ours.
Wherever you are in more danger than you think.
I cannot stand by while innocent lives are lost. Be careful, Diana.
Who is this woman?
She's my secretary, sir. She's a very good secretary.
It is our sacred duty to defend the world, and it's what I'm going to do.
This is the Superhero Pantheon. On this podcast, we take one superhero film a week and decide whether it should be in the Pantheon, the pile of shame, or somewhere in between. My name is Jerome Cuson. You can find me on Twitter at JeromeC1985. You can find additional episodes of this podcast through Apple Podcast, Stitcher, and all of your favorite podcast apps through the real world. We strongly encourage you to leave a 4 or 5 star review so as to help people discover this show and the great work that the folks at The Real World are doing. If you would like to interact with us or send feedback, you can do so in one of 2 ways. First, send an email to superheropantheon@gmail.com. Second, find us on Twitter at HeroPantheon. My co-host for this week and every week will be Brian DeBrain. He can be found on Twitter at Brian DeBrain. And Brian, this has been one of the most talked about movies of the last couple of years, as this is the first DCEU movie that seemed to gain any traction. Of course, none of the movies had previously failed necessarily from a box office perspective, but a lot of people were pretty annoyed at Man of Steel. Even more people were annoyed by Batman vs. Superman. Martha is the word that we will use to kind of describe that hatred. And then comes Wonder Woman, a movie that receives a 95% on Rotten Tomatoes and is generally regarded as one of the best in the DCU, making a ton of money and having a very popular sequel that will be coming out next year in 2020. So Brian, we don't know. I did not put my scores on the notes for this week, so we are going in blind. I don't know whether this is going in the Pantheon or not, Brian.
We'll see. I gave it a high score. I'm not going to give it, away yet. Looking back on all this, it's a great movie, I think. It has its flaws. It's definitely flawed in the villain aspect. It's definitely got some issues with the script, but the strengths of the script, like the dynamic between, like the whole fish out of water stuff. I've never seen Splash. I'm assuming this is what Splash is like in those middle scenes with like her going to London. So maybe I have to watch Splash now. It definitely had that nice like 80s comedy kind of feel to it, and everyone was just kind of clicking in terms of that. So that dynamic works, that part of the script works, but then you get to the villain stuff and all that, and we'll get to that in a bit. It definitely has its flaws, but man, the charm in her performance, the chemistry between Gal Gadot and Chris Pine is great. So all that adds up and it works well. If that didn't work, then the whole movie kind of fails, I think. But because of the strengths of their performances and the way they worked with their chemistry and their lines and their dialogue, it made the movie work.
You mentioned that this was kind of a throwback to the comedies of the 1980s. Those specific scenes that you're referring to where Diana is in London with Steve and some of the other characters, they are an homage to Superman, where Superman encountered urban life for the first time. The protagonist, just like in Superman, gets a formal, bespectacled attire, stops a mugging attack, and has some trouble with a revolving door. That is what we got to see from Gal Gadot in there. And a number of other films were cited as being very influential on this one, including Batman Begins from 2005, a movie that we will be reviewing later on this summer, the Indiana Jones adventure movies, Casablanca, as well as The Little Mermaid. Of course, this is a very much talked about movie. There was a point when Patty Jenkins was going to direct this movie all the way back in 2005, just 2 years after her Academy Award winning movie Monster, but because of a pregnancy, she had to step down. Jenkins has claimed that Wonder Woman is the film she has been wanting to do her whole life, and that she was fortunate to be able to come back to it. It's also worth noting that Nicholas Winding Refn, the director of such movies as Drive, among others, was interested in directing the film and would have insisted on Christina Hendricks for Wonder Woman, and that movie would have been very, very different, and I have no idea whether it would have been good or not. But Patty Jenkins, of course, having to take off 15 years between movies, or 14 years, and I think that's really unfortunate, given how good Monster was and given how good this was. The fact that we went 12 years between a superhero film featuring a woman and 14 years for a female director, I mean, I think this kind of speaks to some of the problems that are inherent in the Hollywood system.
Yeah, and it's kind of some, it's a bunch of bullshit, but at the same time, we're learning now, and obviously she's getting paid now, and she's come back for the sequel, so everything's kind of, the ship is kind of put in the right direction, but that gap in between, and look, I saw Monster when it first came out, and I was blown away at not only the direction, but the way she's able to get the performances out, like Charlize Theron and Christina Ricci in that movie. So looking at the pre-production, going back to 2016, I was like, Patty Jenkins, why does that sound so familiar? And then you go back and you look up, it's from her work on Monster. And then I started thinking, like, man, maybe she can really pull out some really good performances out of these people. And it works, because she seems to be good at getting good performances out of her actors. And I think that's one of her strengths. Even the action sequences, it didn't seem, this was like her first kind of stab at doing an action sequence, it seemed like. But she even pulled that off well. Because that scene where Diana's going from the trench and starts fighting on front, that was a spectacular sequence. So, props to her for kind of going in there, not having that experience, but kind of just, building up that 10 years of frustration. She went in there with a purpose, and, she wanted to make this movie all her life. And you can kind of tell that this is kind of a passion project for her, and you can kind of see it on the screen. So good for her. And like I said, it's a bunch of bullshit with what Hollywood has been doing in the last 80 years, but times are changing, and especially now, everything's kind of going in the right direction. So hopefully things will change in the future, and we'll get more opportunities for women.
Absolutely. You mentioned the No Man's Land sequence, which is something that we will discuss a little bit later on. There was some confusion for some people on the creative team. They thought it was meant to be an action sequence and didn't understand how it could work without Diana fighting a villain, but Patty Jenkins insisted that this scene was a pivotal, dramatic moment, and as it underscored Diana's self-affirmation and her resolution. And absolutely, that is the case. I mean, the No Man's Land sequence is probably one of the most memorable scenes from a superhero movie of the last decade, I would say. And it not only extends past even when they go into the town and we hear the Wonder Woman score for the first time in the movie, but there is also a little bit of discussion about why this took place in World War I as opposed to the Second World War, because in the comics, that is where Steve Trevor and Diana meet. The change in World Wars was made because the filmmakers thought that era was more suitable, and because this World War I was a point when civilization was just finding its roots, but it's not something that we really know the history of in this world. There are questions about women's rights, about a mechanized war where you don't see who you are killing, and they said it was a very interesting time. And I don't know if I didn't find any quotes about this, but I have a feeling that the twist that is revealed in the end, it doesn't play as well if it is World War II as opposed to World War I because of the whole Nazi thing, but we'll get into that a little bit later. But any thoughts on that, Brian?
I like the decision because we're so used to just seeing all these, World War II movies. It's become like a genre within itself. Spielberg, for example, with Saving Private Ryan, kind of like epitomized that. But it's good they switched it up because back in like the whole Franz Ferdinand thing, and that's not as, World War I is not as, I don't want to say publicized, but, it kind of is less publicized than World War II has been in the last 50 years in terms of like you watch these commercials on like back in the 90s for all these VHS tapes. It's usually about World War II and stuff like that. It's never about World War I. So I like that. and it makes you kind of go back and kind of pay attention because I took Euro history in high school and it kind of threw me back and like, oh, I remember that. And I wonder if they're going to mention Franz Ferdinand and all that kind of thing. But, they mentioned some of the stuff and it was pretty, I like it a lot because it gives you this other kind of look because we're so used to that World War II uniform kind of look and this kind of switches it up a bit. So I like that aspect of it. And I like the idea of this, like at that time in World War One, what's really the thing about World War One is, this kind of be like a history kind of lesson thing, but weaponizing chemicals. That was kind of one of the first. That was like the first time that the world started doing that, and that caused the millions of deaths in the war. Is all these weaponized, experimental kind of things. So I'm glad they touched on that because that's kind of like a real thing that people don't really know about World War One, where that's where really weapons started to get really fucked up around that time. So I'm glad they picked that era.
Definitely. And one of the things that this movie is definitely much more so than a lot of MCU movies is it's a little bit more graphic in some of its discussion as we get a nude scene involving Steve and Diana. And there is a point when they have an extensive conversation on the boat and they discuss the pleasures of the flesh. And that is, it was a little bit striking to me because I think one of the things that MCU movies occasionally get criticized for is that they're almost asexual, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that it is Disney, and the romantic aspects of those movies don't really get a chance to shine. But here, you definitely got a lot of that, and the fact that this movie really does earn its PG-13 rating, I think makes it very distinctive from a lot of the other MCU movies, and I think Aquaman also kind of continued that trend with the way that it handled its romantic angles as well.
Yeah, I don't see any way other to do it because, like, that's the first time she's seen a man, and she has this naivete about her, right, because she's never seen it, so it creates that automatic dynamic of curiosity that I think that's one of the strengths of the script. So that part of the comedy I really like, so I'm glad that, they kind of went with that direction. Yeah, I think that those choices they made were kind of paid off. Yeah, I think Diana was just really funny in this movie throughout, so I think it really paid off.
All right, this is a film, one of the first ones to feature the DC film intro, and it features a number of the characters, and I'm going to be honest, it really pales in comparison to what Marvel has done, and I think this movie, in a lot of ways, is better than most of the MCU movies, but that DC film intro is still pretty cheesy, and they need to work on it.
Yeah, I think they got to start putting in like the actual actors as opposed to because it's just the animated version of them. So I think they got to change that up a bit. It does feel like kind of a ripoff because I was like, oh shit, they're doing the MCU thing, but it's DC. But I can't remember who did it first, but I'm pretty sure it was the MCU. But they should change it up a bit, maybe kind of make it its own kind of thing. But it does feel very Marvel-ish.
Right, and I think that because DC has such a great track record with the animated movies, I think that's kind of why they did it, but ultimately I think they kind of have to come up with something that is just a little bit more distinctive, and I think the more that they could separate themselves from Marvel, the better, and I think not necessarily playing in a shared universe is ultimately going to be to DC's benefit because I think that this movie has a lot of visual charm that even some of the MCU movies don't have. And when we get to the technical parts, we will discuss that. But we have to talk about the heroes because that's where we start. And of course, it all begins with Gal Gadot, who is probably one of the most important figures of superhero filmmaking of the last few years, and she will continue to be over these next 5 to 10 years. However long she chooses to play this character, because I think that she immediately established herself as an iconic performer in this role. She absolutely nails Wonder Woman. She nails every aspect of who she is because she is able to capture kind of the charm that Christopher Reeve brought to the Superman character. She kind of has to play dual roles, even though she doesn't necessarily have like a secret identity. She does have to play kind of this confident action goddess, but also has to be naive to the ways of the world. But although she is naive, she's never portrayed as dumb. And the thing that I like so much is that from the very beginning, she knows that Ares is involved. And she's not wrong in her assessment. She's wrong in the fact that men are bad. But the fact of the matter is that she is correct in her assessment in a way of what is going on. And I think that one of the big concerns that I had was that she did stick out in Batman vs. Superman. It's pretty amazing to think that in a movie that was anticipated for as long as it was, that the best person in it was Wonder Woman. And for all the flaws and the bad aspects of that movie, I think that Wonder Woman's introduction in that movie is one of the most iconic moments in a superhero movie. And whereas, Black Panther really stuck out in Civil War, I think he kind of lost his impact in his movie, but I think Wonder Woman retains her impact even in this lead role. She exhibits her heroic qualities throughout the whole film. And for all of those reasons, I think Gal Gadot is absolutely spectacular in this movie, and I think she really sticks out in a positive way, and her impact is not any less because she's in the lead role.
Yeah, I thought she was great too, man. She brings a lot to the table to this role. Because if you compare it to Batman versus Superman, she's clearly a different person, obviously. She's aged a lot. And I was not expecting, I didn't know what to expect when I watched this movie, knowing that it was, taking place years beforehand, right? So seeing the differences in the performance and seeing the range of the character, it was great to see this different kind of persona, because what we saw in Batman versus Superman was very much this, it seemed like she's been through a lot, been there, kind of done that, kind of war-ridden kind of thing. Here, like we said, she's not, she's never been in a war before. In fact, you see the very first time she kills someone on the beach. And, she's very, it didn't really affect her that much because she's, the way she was trained, obviously. She's a strong-willed warrior. So seeing that aspect of her killing someone for the first time and not necessarily being affected by it, but still having this humanity to her, saving people. So I like that range of emotion that she kind of carried there. And I feel like her performance really just elevated this movie. And, I didn't know what to expect, because at first when she was casted and the rumors that she was actually going to, have Wonder Woman in Batman vs. Superman, I was kind of skeptical, because I'd watched some of the Fast movies and I'm not really a fan of the Fast movies. So when I saw that and he was like, oh, that's, she's going to be Wonder Woman, I don't know if she has the size for it, but she definitely has the confidence to back up the role. And because of that, you kind of overlooked her kind of size, but because she carries the role so strongly and it just carries so well that she just knocks it out of the park. So in terms of that, she did a fantastic job, and I think she did better than Captain Marvel. So,
all right, I think whereas a lot of these superhero movies have a great lead character, just like Black Panther, I think this movie has some very good supporting performances as well. The most standout of which is, of course, Chris Pine. Chris Pine, who is he best known for being Steve Trevor, or is he best known for being Captain James T. Kirk at this point? He is one of the Chris's, though, and he is either the second or third most popular Chris, depending on who you're talking to in the online world. But Steve Trevor very much gets to be his own character, and also heroic. He is not a superhero, but you get to see, and he gets to introduce Diana to the world as it is, and I think that his perception of the world is interesting and also not altogether wrong, but he is kind of missing the supernatural and superhero elements of it. He doesn't understand that Ares is real and that he can be a part of this world. And I think what he is able to do is his chemistry with Gal Gadot. He has one of the best interpersonal relationships ever realized in a superhero movie, because they function as a practical couple who is able to do things right and to kind of get things right. But they are also able to function romantically as well.
Yeah, I think, like I said, their chemistry is fantastic. And I think Steve Trevor, half the movie I kept thinking, man, this is such a Captain Kirk kind of performance. But at the same time, he kind of makes it his own. And that speech at the end, him saying, we're all to blame, you know what I mean? And that just reminded me of my history teacher, trying to explain World War I to us. It's pretty much everyone was to blame, and everyone had to take responsibility for what happened in World War I. And that's kind of emphasized in that speech, and I thought that's a great kind of perspective, because, and he goes there's no one villain in this war, and I was like, that's another great way to put it, because, like I said, World War I was just all over the map, literally, and there wasn't just one person to blame. You can say that Franz Ferdinand was to blame because he ignited the spark to the war, right? Or the death of Franz Ferdinand. But it really was just everyone's personal agendas, and that kind of he emphasized that a lot in the speech, and that perspective of his character, is kind of like what everyone was kind of going through, man. It was like insanity in that during those 4 or 5 years. So in that perspective, I liked a lot, and it really puts, it really guides Wonder Woman a lot. So her final decision making, and by the end, I mean, in the end, they kind of fridged him. It's kind of like the reverse, right? They fridged him at the end, and by the time, like in Captain Marvel, like, I hate to compare it, but like that moment where like they're tying her down, right? And then all of a sudden you see Steve Trevor just blow up in a plane, and she just burst out with like all this power, kind of the same way in Captain Marvel, where she was held down, and then she just burst out with all this power fighting back. So I thought that was a little interesting kind of comparison. But yeah, I thought Chris Pine did a great job. I hope that they don't necessarily bring him back. I have my theories as to why he's appearing in the sequel, but he should definitely stay dead.
Yes, we will absolutely be talking about some of those theories and one of the burning questions later on. But I love the fact that they have tremendous chemistry and that they are both right and wrong in so many ways. And I think a lot of the side characters are nice garnish on this delicious salad, if you will. I like Connie Nielsen and Robin Wright. Robin Wright kind of playing the mentor role. And I know that this is something that you like a lot, but the thing that I love so much about Robin Wright's character, and she really is only in it for like 10 minutes, but she always is telling Diana that she could be stronger. And I really appreciated that part of it. And I love that how different that Connie Nielsen and Robin Wright are. Again, they're not necessarily portrayed as being right or wrong or bad or good, but they kind of just are. And I think that is something that these movies tend to not get right all the time, that the mentor is either secretly evil or just purely good. And I think that in some ways Robin Wright is right to do what she's doing and wrong in some other cases. And I do like Antiope and Samir and Charlie. I think they're fun in their own ways. They're maybe not fully developed characters, but they still get their moments. And even a character like Etta, played by Lucy Davis, who plays kind of the secretary to Steve Trevor, she probably could have had more to do, and I think it would have worked, but I think that her role is almost perfect in that she gets to play off of Diana so well and interact with Steve, and I think that's what the side characters, that's what their purpose is to make the movie more fun and to also kind of enhance how we see the lead characters, and I think they did that in almost every conceivable way. And for all of those reasons, I think the side characters are a huge strength of this movie on the hero side.
Yeah, they're good. It's just I feel like, I don't know if this is like a writing thing, but if you would have eliminated those 3 side characters that you meet halfway through the movie, Samir and all them, like it would have been the same movie. Like everything would have just been the same. And I kept thinking, like, I feel like we're just kind of like wasting time with these other characters because there's all these other characters we already just got introduced to, and now you're introducing us 3 more characters. I thought it was a little too much. And then that's where I was getting those flashbacks back to Captain America, First Avenger, and then the whole idea of doing a prequel in the past kind of thing, and instead it was World War II there. So that's kind of where I was like, I don't know if I'm leaning towards like this is copying Captain America a little too much, but I felt like those side characters were not necessarily useful. I mean, they were useful in a sense where they did stuff for the mission, but I felt like, they were not necessary to the overall story. So.
The one thing I will say in response to that is that it is a very familiar trope to have kind of the team of misfits. That's something that we've seen in a lot of other movies. Even Inglourious Bastards kind of plays with that idea as well. So I don't know if it's necessarily just ripping off Captain America, but I think it is a very common trope of these kinds of movies. And I think some do them well and some don't do them so well. I think Captain America did it very well. I think this movie also does it very well. So my hero score is a perfect 10, and I think it's for all of those reasons, the way the characters interact with each other, the performances by everybody involved. So I'm giving this a full 10.
I'm going to go with a 9 just because I feel like there's just too many like hero characters that it kind of just, the scales are just so out, mismatched, because we're going to get to the villains in a second, but I feel like the scales are just way too mismatched, and we kind of a little more focused on the villains and less on these 3 other characters that we really didn't need. So,
but you obviously agree the performances by Gal Gadot and Chris Pine are more than good enough, because a 9 is still an excellent, excellent score, and I feel like you should highlight the positive end of things as well.
Of course, I mean, like I said, the performances are fantastic and the chemistry is out, through the roof. But it was just a little too much for me, and it was just like we have enough characters. Let's just focus on this. But they wanted more, and Yeah, we got those little comedy bits at the end, but still a 9 for me is pretty high.
I think that one of the big things about superhero movies is that they always feel like they need to have a villain, and I almost wonder if Patty Jenkins had complete and total power, if she would have eliminated the need for a villain altogether or reduced the impact even farther, because the villains get so little to do here. You have evil German soldiers who are borderline faceless at the beginning of this. One of the things I really like about this movie is I do like the action sequences, but they do not make you care at all about the evil German soldiers. Danny Houston from X-Men Origins Wolverine is in this movie. I don't think that's really a good sign because he was pretty much a generic villain character in that movie. He is as well here. The gas is kind of a MacGuffin and goal, but the character development is severely lacking. And I guess we could talk a little bit about the twist here, as David Thewlis, who has been a part of the Harry Potter movies and so many other British dramas, he's the big bad Ares the whole time, and he is manipulating the war from the British side, thus subverting the idea of the evil Axis. And that's the main reason that you could not do this with World War II, because I think people would be pretty pissed off.
Yeah, that's for sure. In terms of his performance, man, I don't know. Like, I thought it was a little too comedic at the end. Like, it was just a little too CGI-ish at the end when he became, like, the Ares with the armor and stuff. That's definitely, some minus points there. But I think what Patty Jenkins was trying to do, and this was what I kind of figured out halfway through, is, like, the villain is not necessarily Ares. The villain is not necessarily the other. I forget his name. The other guy, the general guy. Basically, like war in general. The war itself is the villain, because they mention the war so much more so than they do the word Ares, and like, you know what I mean? Like, they emphasize war so much. I think the overall villain is the war itself. That's kind of what I got from this, and I thought that maybe that's just kind of like the way she was directing it, and that makes sense as to why the villains are so weak in this, is because the villain is not them. The villain is the war itself. So in terms of that, if you interpret it that way, it kind of comes off a little better. But still, like, that doesn't excuse like the lack of emphasis and the lack of input they put on the villains. Like, they didn't really try too hard in terms of the characters they presented. I know they did the red herring thing, and it was kind of obvious that he was going to end up being Ares or something like that. But it feels like every superhero movie has to do that kind of twist. You know what I mean? But I feel like in the end, like, it wasn't really that big of a deal, and I felt like Ares, if that was really truly as powerful as he says he is, he didn't need to like talk to Wonder Woman at the end and just let the plan go, and he didn't even need to talk to her and just let it go, and then the bombs would have gone off and everything, and the war would have still been going on. So I don't know.
Right. I think the villain part of this is very confusing, and there's a lot of high-minded thought going on here, which I appreciate. I appreciate the fact that they were going for something much higher than I think a lot of MCU movies, even in comparing this to a Captain America or a Captain Marvel. They were clearly trying to make a statement about war, just beyond war is bad, but really looking at kind of the nuances of it. And even though I don't think they were all together successful, I really appreciate the fact that they tried. And I think the twist was interesting. I don't know if it was well executed with kind of the big CGI battle at the end. But despite that, I am giving this a 6, which is a significant step down from the hero score. I still think that there was a good effort being made. And like I said, I really did appreciate the twist, but I definitely cannot give this a high score.
Yeah, I give it a 6 as well. It just felt like the plan and that speech at the end, that cliche that every villain has to explain his plan to the hero and then try to convince him to join them, and then obviously they're not going to join him. So I was just kind of done with that.
There was a lot of monologuing there, as cited in the first Incredibles movie.
Yeah, a lot of monologuing there, and that kind of really kind of brought it down for me. And you look at the running time; it's 2 hours and 20 minutes. You could have easily cut 10 to 15 out of that based on that scene alone.
The one thing I will say, and this is actually a good transition into talking about the story, even though this movie is 2 hours and 21 minutes, I will be honest, I think this was a much easier watch than Elektra. I think this, in a lot of ways, was an easier watch than some of other movies that we've watched recently, and I very much appreciated that. And even though this is an origin story, I think DC has probably made the two best origin stories that have ever been put to film, this one and Batman Begins, which we will be reviewing later on. I think we get to see Diana mature so much throughout. I love the fact that she sees a number of moves in training right at the beginning that we see her execute throughout the rest of the film, and I think that's awesome. I love that they did that and that they kind of teased that out, and that you could tell that they were very meticulous about putting this together. And even though there is some CGI, I think this movie feels very tangible, and I love some of the ideas again throughout. Her mom doesn't want her to be powerful while her aunt does. I love that Steve Trevor literally lands on the island and that this kind of becomes a quest movie. And I'll let you talk a little bit about the beginning of the movie if you want, but I really do like the idea that from the very beginning, Diana wants to be a hero. She wants to be a part of the world. And in the moment when Steve could be drowning, she decides that she is going to be the person that rescues him.
Yeah, and I don't know if you noticed, but like there was no hesitation in her jumping off like a 50-foot cliff to go save this person she's never seen before. So I thought that kind of spoke to her as like a whole, like that heroic character that she truly is, and just kind of being selfless in that moment, not knowing who this person is. This person could be this evil person drowning, but she, is risking her life to go save him. So that kind of spoke to a lot. But the beginning is great. I think a lot of the strength, and I mentioned this already, but is that kind of comedy dynamic they create with the whole fish out of water thing when she gets to London, and it's just like all this comedy gold that's happening, right? From like when she's trying on the dresses, like when she's trying to bring a sword around town, right? When she sees the baby, like when she eats the ice cream, like all that stuff is like hilarious, and that's what makes it so charming. And those are the scenes that I kind of remember the most out of this movie. I mean that, and the scene coming at her coming out of the trench, but I really love those scenes, and it makes it feel like they really did a good job on that part of the script where it felt like every line and everything that every character was doing between the assistant, Steve, and Diana, like it just felt like each person was like in a different kind of mindset, and because of that, it felt like each one was on a different planet, obviously, right? Because Diana's never seen this before. And then the assistant's never seen like a really strong-willed woman before questioning things, right? And Steve's just trying to hold everything together and trying to get to the place and give the book, right? And that whole dynamic just works so well, I feel. And that was just like the best part of the movie for me. And it reminds me of like, I don't know. I mean, I've never seen Splash, but I'm assuming that's what Splash is like. Because when you mentioned Little Mermaid, I was like, yeah, I definitely got the Little Mermaid type vibes there too. So I thought that part of it was great. And, making the audience like smile and laugh like that, it really wins the audience over. So when you can charm an audience like that and you have these characters that people are loving and are just digging into, like it really helps. Because there are a lot of flaws that we talk about, or the villains, and then kind of like the way that the third act kind of plays out. Because the third act is just kind of like, man, like, why are you talking to Diana? Just don't talk to her, and she's not going to help it or anything, because she's kind of like turned against humanity. Because she pretty much said like she's not going to help Steve, and Steve goes off and tries to save the plane, and she kind of regrets that like 5 minutes later. But if he would not have said anything at all, like the plane would have gone off probably. I don't think Steve would have saved the plane, and the chemicals would have gone and just killed thousands of people, and the war would have continued. So I don't know. If I was Ares, I wouldn't have done that. But it just seems like the whole third act kind of felt like they had to kind of put everything together, had to do the reveal, because they built it up the whole time about Ares, and we never get to see him until the end officially. So it felt like they kind of had to rush the ending, even though the ending was it felt longer than a lot part of the other parts of the movie. So the ending was just a little too long for me, but. That's kind of my criticism of the story.
All right, I do want to go backwards. You mentioned some of the comedy involving the fish out of water. I also love the men in rooms talking, not being able to comprehend the idea of a woman even being in the same room, and I think part of that is played for comedy. Part of that kind of addresses the very real concern and the very real things that still exist, because even 100 years later, these are still issues that permeate society, and the fact that it does, I think, speaks to how relevant this still is and how far we still need to go. And I think when they first go to the battlefield, and we get the best sequence of the film, of course, being No Man's Land, which is so well directed. And I am not a big fan of the Zack Snyder slow-mo. I think that Patty Jenkins does so much with it, though, in some of the action sequences. And even though I still think there's too much of it, I think the slow-mo is well done, and I think it just shows how powerful of a person that Wonder Woman is, and just how good she is at being a hero, and how much of a warrior that she is. I think people have this vision of what No Man's Land could look like, and from a historical perspective, I love the way that it was rendered, and the way that it was portrayed, and the way it was the way it was written. And even though it's not there's not a lot of CGI, there's not a lot of tremendous like crowd pleasing action like you would get in an MCU movie necessarily, but I think it's so well done. And one of the other things that I think that this movie does so well throughout is this film takes the time to show the realities of war, showing how soldiers are impacted and how an entire village can be decimated by things. And I think it is so rare for a movie to show the soldiers and innocent victims be victimized. That's something that you don't even see in movies like Saving Private Ryan. So this movie, I think, is able to function as a war movie. It's able to function as kind of a romantic comedy, and I think it's able to function as an action movie. And the fact that the ending doesn't really work, I think is representative of the fact that it's trying to end basically 3 different movies, and not all of it is going to work. And I think the payoff with Steve and Diana's storyline, I think works tremendously, because Steve does sacrifice his own life for the sake of saving the day and making sure the gas doesn't get released. And I think that he ultimately kind of asserts himself as a hero, and that payoff is really great. The payoff with Ares and Wonder Woman, I think, is interesting. I don't think that it altogether works. But I think if we compare this to some of the other endings that we have talked about and reviewed as part of this series, I think that even some of the endings that are a part of our Pantheon have not necessarily worked as well. I'm not sure how good the ending to, for example, Superman is, or Iron Man, or Guardians of the Galaxy are. I don't think that those endings are all that much better than this one. So for all of those reasons, and this is my very elongated explanation, that is why I am giving a story score of an 8, because even though the ending does not work, I think that the rest of this movie does.
I'm gonna go with a 7, just because I felt like the Ares stuff was just kind of like baffling to me, because like I just felt like they didn't really write that character, like they didn't really fully think that character out, right? And then the ending kind of doesn't work. So I'm gonna go with a 7, even though I feel like a lot of the strength is in that part of the movie and the dialogue, and all, there's all this other representation stuff too, and the metaphors and all those kind of things, but I just felt like it kind of like lost itself by the end.
All right, let's go to the technical aspect of this movie. All right, let's talk about the technical aspects of the movie. Let's first talk about the score. I love the score. I loved first hearing it in Batman vs. Superman. It was so well done, and I love how they did not play it until after the No Man's Land sequence, when she gets into the village for the first time. And that the way that they do that music cue is so great. And it's not iconic, but I just love the way that they did that. And I love the visuals. It's very good. There's a lot of color in the beginning of the movie, and then it kind of waters things down as they go into the war, which I think makes a lot of sense. And even though I still think there are some issues with kind of the Zack Snyder color palette, I think that it does come off better here because of the time period, and again, because they are on the battlefield. I love Wonder Woman's suit. It is great because it's not overtly sexual, but it is practical. The Amazons are shot so much more respectfully than they are in Justice League, and when we talk about Justice League, we'll talk a lot about that. I love the editing and the pacing of this movie, and I love the screenplay from a dialogue perspective. I know that, again, this all comes back to the ending for a lot of people, and I know that it does not work, but again, I think that the technical aspects of this movie are extremely strong for the most part, so I am giving this an 8.
Okay, yeah, I'm going to give it an 8 too. I love the score. I didn't like the CGI at the end. I didn't like that the ending took place at night, and I thought it could have been a little bit better during like a early morning kind of dusk kind of looking sequence. I think it would have been shot a little bit better, but again, like I'm not too much of a fan of like darker colors, and I'm a fan of some of the Zack Snyder stuff in Man of Steel, but the World War One sequences and the action sequences when they got to like the trench and stuff, it's very darkly like lit and dark colors. But again, like you mentioned, like it's for a reason, because if you really think about it, there's a lot of like smoke in the clouds, right? So obviously the natural lighting is going to be very dim. So that in that case, if they're going for natural lighting on the outdoors, it makes sense to do that. So in that respect, it makes sense, and it kind of gives you that gloomy, kind of dark, kind of depressing feel that war is supposed to bring you. So that works. I do like the beginning where, I mean, their mascara looks incredible, even though it's what 50% CGI. You know, some of it was shot on the island, and then they added kind of the rest of it. But I thought that stuff looked great. I thought that that pool, like the whirlpool, not whirlpool, but like their bathing thing where Steve was naked, and then they like, what is that? Oh, it's a watch. But that lighting on the water was incredible, I thought, because that cave was so dark, but that beautiful light blue was coming out really well. So they did a good job with the colors in terms of that, and the score's great, and the cues were right on. So I'm gonna give it an 8. It could have been a little better, but I don't know. I just feel like because they're kind of limited to the time frame, like you said, like you're kind of limited to certain kind of lighting. There wasn't, a lot of unnatural, you know what I mean, like electrical kind of lighting back then. There was very much natural lighting in 1918. So in that regard, it makes sense.
All right, the legacy of this movie, I think, is unquestioned, even though it's been less than 2 years since this movie has come out. I think the anticipation for Wonder Woman 1984 is very high. We are never going to have to wait 10 years between female-led superhero movies again. I mean, the fact of the matter is that we are getting Wonder Woman in 2020. We are going to get Captain Marvel probably in 2021 or 2022. And we are going to get a bevy of other female superhero-led projects. This is a movie... Sorry, Brian, I have to cough. This is a movie that made Gal Gadot a star. It made Patty Jenkins a wanted woman, and she should never have to wait 15 years between directing movies. She's ultimately going to get to complete this trilogy. Chris Pine, I think, is no longer regarded as just Captain James T. Kirk, and he kind of is able to spread his wings, be a character actor, and is able to kind of get these supporting roles. I think this made the DC universe viable again and kind of gave them a blueprint for the future, giving filmmakers more of a voice in creating their movies. Again, differentiating from the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And even though the Justice League came out and was pretty much a bomb, I still think that the DC Universe has learned their lesson from this movie. In particular, this also received a 95% on Rotten Tomatoes and was a monumental box office success. I don't agree with the assessment that this should have been a Best Picture contender, but from a legacy standpoint, it does not get any better than this. I am giving this also a perfect 10.
Wow. Okay. You got me on the clock here, or put me on the spot here, but like because I have a 9 down, but I'm still gonna go with a 9. This is the highest grossing domestically. DCU of the DCEU, this universe is the highest grossing one. It kind of was like the thing that saved it. You know what I mean? Everyone thought that if this movie failed, then the whole franchise would just be going just down the tubes because of what happened with Batman vs Superman prior. Actually, what was before this? Suicide Squad did not really make a lot of people happy either.
Even though it was, you are correct that it did not make a lot of people happy, but that movie was a huge box office success.
That too, but people were just kind of like, what's going on? But this kind of like, answered those questions, and they picked the right people for it. I'm going to go with a 9 because I feel like, I don't know, like, I think a 10 should have been like, it would have been nominated for Best Picture kind of thing. That would have been a 10 for me, but it was highly successful, and it kind of turned the ship around a little bit, but they couldn't fix Justice League in time, obviously. But I think you can see some of the repercussions of this into Aquaman, if you know what I mean. Like just picking the right people, picking the right kind of look and design, not necessarily the Zack Snyder look. So I think they kind of learned from that.
All right, Brian, moment of truth. My total score for this is a 42.
I have 39, so there you go. It's in.
It is into the superhero pantheon. Just like Guardians of the Galaxy, in that case, your score was above a 40 and ultimately is what put it over the hump and into the superhero pantheon. In this case, it is my score of 42 that puts this into the superhero pantheon. And if you can believe this, Brian, this is just our second DC movie to go. All the others have been MCU thus far, and part of that has been because this has been very MCU heavy, but other than The Incredibles and Superman, this is the only MCU movie that's gone into the Pantheon thus far?
Well, we're gonna get to some more, obviously, because we got the summer Batman coming up. But I think it was kind of interesting and pretty good that we went to this first before we went through all the Batman stuff. So kind of give that perspective because we know there's some heavy hitters coming out of that one. So it's good to have this one in the Pantheon. It totally deserves it. Even with my criticisms of the plot, you know what I mean? Like every film has its weaknesses, but again, like its strengths kind of, shift the scales a little bit and kind of raises it above a level that Gal Gadot couldn't pull it off. And if it was someone else, I don't think it would have worked as well. So good for her. And she kind of took it to the next level.
And I think it's one of those things where I think the ending was only disappointing because how good the rest of the movie was. And I think whereas there are some movies where the ending's kind of mediocre and the rest of the movie's kind of mediocre, I think that the reason that people were ultimately so disappointed is because of what the rest of the film was doing. And I'm really glad that we have put this into the superhero pantheon. But before we talk about what is coming up next week, we have to discuss the burning questions. Brian, the first one: how dumb is Marvel for letting Patty Jenkins go over to DC?
Pretty dumb, but hindsight, it was a different time then, so different power structures, obviously, and things have obviously changed now with Captain Marvel coming out. So obviously they kind of became a little woke, a little bit, you know what I mean? And they kind of learned from their rival. And this was a big deal that kind of DC kind of beat them to the punch, considering how successful the MCU was at that time compared to the DCU. So good for them.
All right, question number 2: is the Diana Steve romance the best we've seen in a superhero movie? The only other romance that I can think of that has come close thus far, based on everything we've reviewed, is Superman and Lois. And I think this feels so much more equal than that movie because it doesn't help that there wasn't a kiss that magically reduced everything to nothing, but it just feels like even though Steve is not powerful, they're still kind of equals in some way. And the fact that they are both intelligent and the fact that they both kind of compensate for each other's weaknesses, in my opinion, this is the best romance that we've seen in a superhero movie to this point.
It's one of the best. It's hard to say because it's just one movie, and sometimes you want like this to carry out through all the other movies. So we'll see kind of how that plays out. But it's definitely up there. I would still say like Pepper Potts and Tony kind of come probably the top two that I think about it. Those are like the top two that immediately come to mind. So maybe 1A, 1B.
Also, how happy is this? Is not a burning question, but how happy is Chris Pine with the writing saying that he is an above average man?
Slightly above average.
Absolutely. All right, question 3: does Patty Jenkins deserve a chance to direct a Justice League movie if she wants?
I mean, that's what I felt like as soon as coming out of Wonder Woman. I felt like she should have been the one to direct Justice League because I think she gets character development way more, and she definitely got that out of this one. And this is like definitely the first movie of the DCU to have like truly, really great character development from beginning to end. And I think that's what you kind of need. So yeah, I hope, but again, like, we pretty much had a deleted Justice League movie. Like, there was supposed to be another Justice League movie coming out this year, but it got pretty much canceled because of the fiasco. So, we still need Darkseid. I don't know if we've talked about this. Do they stay away from the Justice League as a whole for 5-6 years and do singles solo movies? But I think she'd be the one to do it, and it depends on her, what she wants to do. If she's confident enough to do it, like, does she want to, tackle all these different characters? It's up to her, but I'm for it.
As far as I'm concerned, if this is what she wants to do, and that she deserves it, because it's very obvious that she is able to get the action sequences down. If she doesn't have any interest, then obviously all of this is a moot point, but I would love to see her get this opportunity because I think Justice League, it is inexplicable to me that a movie where you have Batman and Superman, that movies that have grossed hundreds of millions of dollars, Jason Momoa's Aquaman, Gal Gadot is Wonder Woman, and it made less than all of those other movies. And it's so remarkable to me. So, I don't know. I think DC is going to stay away from the Justice League for quite some time. And I think they are going to focus on kind of developing the individual characters. Not even worry about teasing a Justice League movie for a significant amount of time. And then kind of see what they have. I think we'll see what Shazam does, and then if Shazam does really well, I think there will be that distinct possibility All right, Brian. Is Wonder Woman the best non-Dark Knight trilogy related DC movie ever?
It's tough, man, because looking back, Superman 1 is very, very great. I mean, we put it in the original Superman. We put it in the Pantheon. It's hard to say. It's got to be up there, right? For now, I'll say it's in that kind of category. I definitely think it's better than Dark Knight Rises. I don't know if that's saying a lot, but it's definitely on that level. And it's really hard to think of another movie that comes to mind from the DC that kind of compares to it. Obviously, they tried with Green Lantern and failed. Catwoman failed. So Suicide Squad is not nearly as good as Wonder Woman. So it's probably accurate to say that.
It's either this or the original Superman movie, and I don't think it's really much of a competition elsewhere. I think Batman 1989 is a clear step down from this, but I definitely think the fact that we could even talk about this in the same breath as the original Superman says a lot. All right, let's do a little bit of speculation here. What will Wonder Woman 1984 look like? We know that Chris Pine will be playing Steve Trevor. Apparently, in the movie, we see him. That's one of the first shots that they released. But just like there was a twist in the first one, if you read about some of what happens in comic book lore, there is a distinct possibility that that is not Steve Trevor and that they could do a number of different things. Brian, what is this movie going to look like?
Well, the speculation that I've heard, and I've heard this from one particular person who's kind of like an insider, it's Mark Bernardin on not the Fat Man on Batman podcast, the Fat Man Beyond podcast. That's what they call it now. He speculates that could be Martian Manhunter, because Martian Manhunter is a person that can transform into other people, and that'd be a way to introduce Martian Manhunter into the universe and kind of go from there and kind of play off of that dynamic, because Martian Manhunter is a recurring character on the Supergirl show. So some fans are already familiar with him. So adding that kind of creates this new dynamic. So you can do that. I'm looking forward to like the aesthetic, because I like, I'm a fan of 80s movies like a lot of you are. And I like when, modern movies kind of do that throwback to the 80s time and have that retro kind of feel to them, the way that kind of, the Bumblebee movie, right? That was one of its strengths, kind of giving you that retro kind of feel. So I'm looking forward to that. I'm looking forward to like the emphasis on like, I don't know, like Reaganism and stuff like that. I'm looking forward to like the subtext, you know what I mean? Like the political stuff, because from what I heard, they're going to do some stuff with Russia, right? And that's coming to the end of the Cold War. So it's going to be like a Cold War feel to it, maybe some espionage. But, there's a lot to play with, and we know that we're going to get Cheetah played by Kristen Wiig. So that's going to be an interesting one, because Kristen Wiig obviously kind of stepping out a little bit. She'd had like a serious role in The Martian with some comedy, but this could be, totally different for her. So I'm kind of looking forward to that. And just a lot of things going on with this movie and how they're going to approach the timeline of things, right? Are we going to see a young Bruce Wayne in the background, right? Are we going to see a young Clark Kent in the background? I don't know, but there's a lot of things they can do. And hopefully they have some fun with it. And, there's a lot of expectations and a lot of hype to live up to, but hopefully they can kind of make it its own.
I do like the fact that they moved this movie from November of 2019 to June 2020, because I think it has been proven 2 years between sequels is too short. I think we've seen it happen so often where the movies just don't work, and I like that they're taking their time with this. I think that's so important. All right, so Brian, April is going to be a very different month for this podcast than what people are used to from our times on Pro Wrestling Ponderings, now on the Real World. We have always had a theme of some sort every single month that we've done this podcast just about. Whether it's been MCU, whether it's been kind of the oddball superheroes. We're going to have kind of a Summer of Batman later this month. We're going to have a little bit of X-Men coming up with the final X-Men movie being released. But April is chaotic because while you're all thinking about Avengers Endgame, which is coming out at the end of April, there are actually 3 total superhero movies that are coming out in the month of April. That would be Shazam, Hellboy, and of course the aforementioned Avengers Endgame. So we decided that we would not do a themed month, but what we were left with was basically 2 weeks where there was not going to be anything. What we are going to be doing next week is we are going to review and decide whether Avengers Infinity War goes into the Pantheon. And yes, it is a little soon, but I think there is enough information that we can gather to determine whether this has been put into the superhero pantheon or not. Whether the pop cultural impact is enough to really elevate this into the superhero pantheon. So next week, what we are going to do is we are going to replay our episode from last year where we discussed Avengers Infinity War. We drafted some of the very best moments from that movie. We also drafted our own Avengers teams. So you are going to be able to hear our review from last year, and that is going to be followed up after that by our additional 30 to 45 minutes where we determine whether Avengers Infinity War goes into the Pantheon, the pile of shame, or somewhere in between. And Brian, this really just gives us an opportunity to rewatch Infinity War before Endgame comes out more than anything.
Yeah, and I've been going down some YouTube rabbit holes, man, and I've been watching all these theories and stuff, and now with Captain Marvel coming out, there's even more theories, and I'm just sucked into this wormhole, and I can't exit it until probably after I watch Endgame the 6th time in theaters.
So yes, that is next week, and then in 2 weeks there is going to be a very special edition of this podcast as Brian and I will be joined by Matt Waters and Ben Phillips, and we are going to discuss we're going to do a preview episode of Avengers Endgame. We're going to do a draft just like we did last year. We will explain the rules at that time, and we will do an updated ranking of our MCU movies. And I know Matt Waters is already angry at me for where I put Iron Man 3, but he could go suck on an egg. So that is what we will be doing in 2 weeks, and then we'll be getting into the movies. So April's very different for us, Brian, but I know that you are chomping at the bit for all the pop culture, not just superhero related, that's coming out. It's gonna be a fun couple months.
Yeah, and then going into May, we can talk about that, soon. Next month. But goddamn, May's got some crazy stuff too, and I'm a Godzilla mark, so that, Aladdin, all kinds of other stuff. Yeah, it's gonna be a crazy summer, and I feel like Disney is just gonna take all my money, just every single bit of my money, because I think they're just gonna make $5 billion this year.
The $5 billion is a gross underestimate. There is a distinct possibility they can make $9 to $10 billion this year.
I was playing it safe, but hey, man, if you give Dumbo that much credit, we'll see, because we know Frozen's going to make that bank. The question is Dumbo going to make that bank? So we'll find out.
Well, you've also got episode 9, which is good for $1 billion as well.
Yeah, just give Disney all your money, people, because they're doing the work. They're doing the work.
And The Lion King as well. Can't forget The Lion King.
Yeah, it's almost weird. It's like you have to take a bet, not which one is going to be the highest grossing, but which one is going to be the least grossing of Disney this year. So that's even crazier to think about. So we're in that kind of era.
All right, so we want to thank everyone for your continued support. Again, make sure you leave a 4 or 5-star review to help people discover this podcast. For Brian, my name is Jerome. We thank you so much for listening. We will talk to you again next week.
Oh, look, a baby!